Rebecca stood frozen in the church bathroom, staring at her reflection. The large wall clock ticked loudly, each minute passing like an hour. She had been waiting for over 40 minutes now, her wedding dress starting to feel heavy on her shoulders. "Maybe there's just traffic," said her friend Lily, trying to sound hopeful. But the worry in her eyes told a different story. Rebecca's phone buzzed. Her heart jumped. Finally, but it was just her mother asking if there was any news. Rebecca's fingers shook as she typed "nothing yet" and pressed send. Outside, 200 guests sat in the church pews. The flowers Rebecca had spent months picking out were already starting to wilt in the summer heat. The string quartet had played through their entire playlist twice. "I'm calling him again," said Rebecca, dialing Daniel's number for what felt like the 100th time. Straight to voicemail. Again. An hour passed. Then another. Rebecca's makeup artist had to touch up her face 3 times as tears kept ruining her careful work. "I don't understand," Rebecca whispered. "We were together last night. We were happy. He said he couldn't wait to see me walk down the aisle." Her brother Thomas knocked gently on the bathroom door. When Rebecca opened it, the look on his face told her everything she needed to know. "The best man just called," Thomas said softly. "He's been trying to reach Daniel all morning too. He went to Daniel's apartment and his stuff is gone. His suitcases, his passport. A neighbor saw him leaving with bags at 5 a.m. The room started spinning. Rebecca grabbed the sink to steady herself. "Are you saying he ran away? That he's not coming?" Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, like it belonged to someone else. Nobody answered. They didn't need to. Rebecca's mother pushed through the small crowd that had gathered. "What should we tell the guests?" she asked, practical even in crisis. Rebecca looked at herself one last time in the mirror. The dress she had saved for months to buy. The veil her grandmother had worn at her own wedding 60 years ago. The bouquet of white roses and baby's breath that matched the flowers on the cake nobody would eat now. "Tell them the truth," she said finally. "Tell them he's gone." Walking out to face everyone was the hardest thing Rebecca had ever done. Some guests looked embarrassed, others pitying. A few seemed almost curious, like they were watching a movie instead of her real life falling apart. Her father stood at the back of the church, his face red with anger and hurt for his daughter. "I'll kill him," he muttered as Rebecca approached. "No, Dad," she said, suddenly feeling oddly calm. "Just take me home." That night, surrounded by her closest family, Rebecca sat in her childhood bedroom still wearing her wedding dress. She couldn't bear to take it off. That would make everything real. Her phone had hundreds of messages, but none from Daniel. No explanation, no goodbye, no nothing. What kind of person does this? Her sister asked, pacing the room. What kind of coward disappears without even leaving a note? Rebecca had no answer. 10 years together, 3 years engaged, countless promises made, all gone in a single morning. What she didn't know then, sitting heartbroken in her parents' house with her unused wedding rings still in their box, was that this wasn't the end of her story with Daniel. She couldn't have imagined that 10 years later, long after she had rebuilt her life and heart, he would return in the most unexpected and devastating way. She couldn't have known that the man who abandoned her on what should have been the happiest day of her life would one day try to take away the 4 people who had become her whole world. That the next time she saw Daniel Cooper wouldn't be across a dinner table or on a busy street, but across a courtroom, fighting for the children he claimed were rightfully his. For weeks after the wedding that never happened, Rebecca barely left her apartment. Friends called and texted, but she rarely answered. Her mother brought food that went mostly uneaten. The beautiful honeymoon tickets to Bali sat unused on her coffee table until they expired. "You need to get out," her friend Lily insisted one rainy afternoon, practically dragging Rebecca to the shower. "You've been in the same pajamas for 3 days. What's the point?" Rebecca asked, her voice hollow. But she showered anyway, if only to make Lily stop worrying. 6 months passed this way. Rebecca went through the motions, back to her marketing job, occasional dinners with family, half-hearted attempts at normalcy. But something inside her had changed. The future she planned with Daniel was gone, and she couldn't see a new one taking shape. Then came the package. A heavy box from her cousin in Seattle who worked for a school district. "Thought you might find this interesting," the note read. Inside was information about a teaching program for professionals looking to change careers. Rebecca almost tossed it aside, but something made her open the brochure. Photos of classrooms, of children learning, of adults who had found new purpose after leaving behind jobs that no longer fulfilled them. That night, for the first time in months, Rebecca stayed up late researching. By morning, she had made a decision. "I'm moving," she told her stunned family over Sunday dinner the following weekend. "I'm going to become a teacher." Her brother Thomas looked skeptical. "You've never mentioned wanting to teach before." "I never thought about it before," Rebecca admitted, "but now it's all I can think about." 3 weeks later, Rebecca packed up her apartment, sold what wouldn't fit in her car, and drove 8 hours to start her new life. The small city wasn't anything special, no famous landmarks or tourist attractions, but it wasn't haunted by memories of Daniel. No one there knew her as that poor woman who was left at the altar. The teaching program was intense. Rebecca threw herself into learning, studying late into the night, observing veteran teachers, practicing lesson plans. For the first time since Daniel disappeared, she felt her mind fully occupied with something other than heartbreak. Her student teaching assignment placed her in a 4th grade classroom in one of the city's most underfunded schools. The children came from difficult backgrounds, foster homes, shelters, unstable housing situations. "Miss, are you coming back tomorrow?" asked a small boy named Tyler after Rebecca's first day. "Of course I am," she promised. "I'll be here all semester." "That's what our last teacher said," another child commented, but she left after 2 weeks. Something about their wariness, their expectation of abandonment, struck a chord in Rebecca. These children understood what it meant to be left behind. She didn't just come back the next day. She brought extra supplies bought with her own money. She stayed late helping with homework. She learned each child's story, their strengths, their struggles. By the time Rebecca finished her certification, she knew exactly what she wanted to do. She took a permanent position at the same school and bought a small house nearby with a yard and 3 bedrooms. "It's too big for just you," her mother remarked during her first visit. Rebecca just smiled. "We'll see." The application process for becoming a foster parent was grueling. Background checks, home studies, interviews, training classes. But 2 years after Danielle had left her standing alone in her wedding dress, Rebecca welcomed 8-year-old twins into her home. Jack and July had been in the system since they were toddlers, bounced between 6 different homes. They arrived with everything they owned in 2 small backpacks, their faces guarded and suspicious. "This is just temporary, right?" Jack asked that first night as Rebecca showed them their rooms. "Only if you want it to be," she answered honestly. 6 months later, 6-year-old Tyler, the same boy who'd asked if she was coming back during her student teaching, joined their family after his foster placement fell through. And then came Olivia, just 4 years old, with big eyes and a habit of hiding food in her pockets because previous homes hadn't always fed her regularly. Rebecca's house wasn't too big anymore. It was filled with homework sessions at the kitchen table, impromptu dance parties in the living room, bedtime stories, and weekend trips to the park. 5 years after being abandoned at the altar, Rebecca had built something beautiful from the ruins of her old dreams. The children still had hard days, nightmares about past trauma, fear of being sent away, behavioral challenges that required patience and therapy. But there were also first bike rides without training wheels, school plays where Rebecca sat proudly in the audience, and quiet moments when a child who had never trusted adults would voluntarily reach for her hand. The adoption paperwork for all 4 children was finally completed on a bright spring morning. The judge smiled as he signed the documents, making them officially a family. "Congratulations," he said, "you've given these children a true home." Walking out of the courthouse, Jack, now 10, looked up at Rebecca. "Does this mean we can call you Mom for real now?" Rebecca's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. "If that's what you want." "I've been practicing," he admitted. "I like how it sounds." What none of them could have known, on that perfect day of new beginnings, was that someone from Rebecca's past was watching them leave the courthouse. Someone who had his own plans for the family she had so carefully built. The morning started like any other Tuesday in Rebecca's busy household. The twins were arguing over whose turn it was to feed their pet hamster. Tyler couldn't find his math homework. Olivia wanted her hair braided exactly like the girl on TV. Rebecca moved through the chaos with practiced ease, making lunches while helping with homework and settling disputes. The doorbell rang just as she was pouring cereal into 4 bowls. "Jack, can you get that?" she called out, wiping milk from the counter. "It's some guy in a suit," Jack reported, coming back to the kitchen. "He says he needs to talk to you. Looks super serious." Rebecca wiped her hands on a dish towel. "Finish your breakfast and make sure everyone has their backpacks ready," she told the children. "The bus comes in 15 minutes. The man at the door wore an expensive gray suit and carried a leather briefcase. He didn't smile when Rebecca approached. "Rebecca Mason?" he asked formally. "Yes, that's me. I'm here to serve you with legal papers." He handed her a thick envelope. "You've been named in a custody petition filed by Daniel Cooper." Rebecca's hand froze midair. "What did you say?" "The details are all in the documents," the man continued in the same flat tone. "You're required to appear in family court next Monday at 9 a.m. He turned and walked away without waiting for a response. Rebecca stood in the doorway, the envelope heavy in her hand. Daniel Cooper. A name she had worked so hard to forget. The man who had vanished on their wedding day without a word. And now, after 10 years of silence, he was suddenly filing for custody of her children. "Mom? The bus is coming." Olivia's voice snapped Rebecca back to reality. She tucked the envelope under a cushion on the couch and plastered on a smile. "Coming, sweetie." The children didn't need to know about this. Not yet. Not until she understood what was happening. After the school bus pulled away, Rebecca's hands shook so badly she could barely open the envelope. The legal language was dense and confusing, but certain phrases jumped out at her. Biological parents seeking custody rights, fraudulent adoption, embryos created during prior relationship. None of it made sense. Rebecca and Daniel had never created embryos. They had talked about having children someday, but hadn't taken any steps toward fertility treatments. And her children were adopted through the state foster system. There was no biological connection to either of them. Rebecca called in sick to work and drove straight to her lawyer's office. Penny Lai had handled all 4 adoption cases and had become a friend in the process. "This is nonsense," Penny said after reading through the documents. "Complete fiction, but it's dangerous nonsense. Daniel has hired Westbrook and Associates. They're one of the most aggressive family law firms in the state." "But why?" Rebecca asked, her voice breaking. "Why now? Why claim children he's never even met are somehow biologically his?" "I don't know," Penny admitted. "But we're going to fight this. I'll file our response today. In the meantime, gather all your adoption paperwork, every single document." Rebecca spent the rest of the day in a fog of fear and confusion. She picked the children up from school early, needing them close. They watched a movie together, ate pizza for dinner, and had an impromptu living room fort building competition. She hugged them tighter than usual at bedtime. "You're squishing me, Mom," Tyler complained, but he hugged her back just as hard. Later that night, after the house was quiet, Rebecca searched for Daniel Cooper online. There was surprisingly little information about him. No social media accounts, no company websites, nothing to indicate what he'd been doing for the past decade. It was as if he'd disappeared not just from her life, but from existence itself. Until now. The next morning, a black SUV was parked across the street from their house. Rebecca noticed it while getting the mail. The windows were tinted, but she could make out the silhouette of someone watching. A chill ran down her spine. The car was still there when the school bus came, and again when she returned from work. 3 days it stayed, never moving except to follow when she drove anywhere. On Friday, Rebecca had enough. She marched across the street and knocked on the driver's window. It lowered just enough to reveal a man she didn't recognize. "Why are you watching my house?" she demanded. "Just doing my job, ma'am," he replied coolly. "And who exactly are you working for?" The window rolled back up without an answer. That evening, Rebecca received a text message from an unknown number. "The children deserve to know their real father. This can be easy or difficult. Your choice." She dropped the phone like it had burnt her. Sunday night, Rebecca sat the children down in the living room. Their curious faces looked up at her, trusting and innocent. How could she explain what was happening without scaring them? "Remember how I've told you that families come in all different shapes?" She began carefully. and that what makes a real family is love, not blood. 4 heads nodded. Well, there's someone from my past who's coming back into our lives. His name is Daniel. A long time ago, before I met any of you, he and I were going to get married. What happened? Julie asked. Rebecca took a deep breath. He left, and it hurt very much. But if he hadn't left, I might never have become a teacher or moved here or met all of you. So in a strange way, it turned out to be a good thing. Is he nice? Olivia wanted to know. I used to think so, Rebecca answered honestly. But now he's doing something that isn't nice at all. He's telling people that he should be your dad. But we don't have a dad, Jack said, frowning. We have you. That's right. And nothing is going to change that. But tomorrow we have to go to court, and you might hear some confusing things. I need you to remember that no matter what happens, we are a family. Forever. As the children drifted off to sleep that night, Rebecca sat alone in the kitchen, preparing herself for battle. Tomorrow, she would face the man who had shattered her heart once before. But this time, she wasn't a heartbroken bride. She was a mother fighting for her children. And mothers, Rebecca had learned, are the fiercest fighters of all. The courthouse was bigger than Rebecca remembered. 10 years ago, she'd come here with joy in her heart to get their marriage license. Now she climbed these same steps with 4 nervous children and a knot of fear in her stomach. Remember what I told you, she said quietly to the kids. Stay with Aunt Lily in the waiting area. If anyone asks you questions, just say you want to talk to your mom first. Penny Lai, her lawyer, met them at the entrance. Ready? She asked, her face serious. Rebecca nodded, though she felt anything but ready. Inside the courtroom, she spotted him immediately. Daniel sat at the table across the aisle, head bent toward a man in an expensive suit. He looked different, thinner, with streaks of gray in his dark hair. When he looked up and their eyes met, Rebecca felt a strange emptiness where pain used to be. The hearing was brief but intense. Daniel's lawyer made wild claims about embryos and biological connections. Penny presented the adoption paperwork and demanded proof of Daniel's allegations. The judge, a stern-faced woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, ordered both sides to return in 2 weeks with more evidence. And Mr. Cooper, she added before closing the session, I'm issuing a temporary restraining order. No contact with Ms. Mason or the children until we sort this out. Outside, Rebecca avoided reporters who had somehow caught wind of the unusual case. She hurried the children to her car, breathing only when they were safely driving away. That man doesn't look like a dad, Tyler said from the backseat. He's not your dad, Rebecca replied firmly. He's just confused. But confusion didn't explain the determination she'd seen in Daniel's eyes, or the expensive legal team, or the private investigators still following her. Something else was driving this bizarre custody claim. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Rebecca's phone rang. It was Penny. I hired someone to look into Daniel's background, she said without preamble. You better come to my office tomorrow. There's a lot we need to discuss. Rebecca arranged for her neighbor to watch the kids after school and drove straight to Penny's office the next day. A man she didn't recognize sat beside Penny's desk. He had sharp eyes and a notebook filled with scribbled notes. This is Ray, Penny introduced him. He's a private investigator I work with on difficult cases. Ray didn't waste time with pleasantries. Your ex-fiancé is not who you think he is, he said, opening his notebook. For starters, he hasn't been in the country for most of the last decade. Rebecca stared at him. What do you mean? I mean, Daniel Cooper left the United States the morning of your wedding. He flew to Brazil, then moved around South America using different names. He only returned to the States 3 months ago. But why would he? Money, Ray cut in. It's always about money. His father, Harold Cooper, died 6 months ago. Left behind a fortune in real estate and investments, but here's where it gets interesting. He slid a document across the desk. It was a copy of a will. Rebecca skimmed it, stopping at a paragraph highlighted in yellow. To my son Daniel, I leave the entirety of my estate and holdings, valued at approximately $68 million, with one condition, that he has provided the family with heirs to continue the Cooper name. If at the time of my death, Daniel has not produced children, the estate will be divided among various charitable organizations as listed in Appendix B. Rebecca looked up, stunned. He's claiming my children are his to get his inheritance. That's our theory, Penny confirmed. His father's will was very specific about biological heirs. Without children, Daniel gets nothing. But that's insane. The adoption records are clear. The DNA won't match. He can't possibly win. Ray closed his notebook. He doesn't need to win. He just needs to create enough legal confusion to delay the distribution of the estate while he works on a more permanent solution. What kind of solution? Rebecca asked, suddenly afraid. Penny and Ray exchanged looks. We think he might try to take the children, Penny said quietly. Physically take them. There was a one-way ticket to Venezuela purchased in his name yesterday. Rebecca's hands began to shake. What do we do? First, we increase security. The children don't go anywhere alone. School is informed that only you can pick them up, no exceptions. Second, Ray continued, we gather more information. I need to know what happened 10 years ago. Why did he leave? Did he say anything unusual before the wedding? Any clues about his mental state? Rebecca closed her eyes, trying to remember. The days before the wedding had been a blur of last-minute details and excitement. Daniel had seemed happy, eager even. Except, there was one thing, she said slowly. 2 days before the wedding, we met with a doctor. I'd been having trouble conceiving, and we finally got test results. She swallowed hard. The doctor told us I likely couldn't have biological children. Daniel seemed supportive when we were there, but that night he was quiet, distant. I thought he was just processing the news. And the next day, Penny prompted. The next day he was back to normal. Talking about the honeymoon, our future. He mentioned adoption, actually. Said maybe it was meant to be, that we'd give homes to children who needed them. Rebecca's voice broke. I thought he meant it. Ray made notes. So he knew you couldn't have biological children, pretended to be fine with it, then disappeared rather than face a future without blood hairs. Then his father dies with this specific condition in the will, and suddenly he's back, claiming children that aren't his. Put that way, it made a twisted kind of sense. There's one more thing, Ray said, hesitating. We found records of psychiatric treatment in Brazil. Daniel was diagnosed with issues related to obsessive behavior and narcissistic tendencies. He was briefly institutionalized after what appears to have been a breakdown. Rebecca tried to reconcile this information with the man she thought she'd known. The Daniel she remembered had been kind, thoughtful. A bit driven, yes, but not unstable. We need to tread carefully, Penny advised. This information about his mental health history could help our case, but it might also make him more unpredictable if confronted. As Rebecca drove home, her mind raced with everything she'd learned. The man she'd once loved enough to marry had been living a double life. He'd been monitoring her for years, waiting for the right moment to resurface and use her family for his own benefit. She pulled into her driveway, watching her children play in the front yard with their neighbor. They were laughing carefree, unaware that someone was plotting to tear apart the only stable family they'd ever known. Rebecca took a deep breath. Daniel might have money and desperation on his side, but she had truth and love on hers. And she would do whatever it took to protect her family from the man who had already broken her heart once before. The day of the custody hearing arrived with dark clouds that matched Rebecca's mood. She hadn't slept well for days. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined her children being taken away. You look tired, Jack said as she poured his cereal that morning. Just thinking a lot, Rebecca replied, trying to smile. About the man who wants to be our dad, Julie asked. The twins might only be 10, but they missed nothing. Rebecca set down the milk carton. No one's going to be your dad unless you want them to be. That's a promise. The children stayed with Rebecca's brother Thomas during the hearing. The courtroom was more crowded this time. Word had spread about the unusual case, and several reporters sat in the back row scribbling notes. Daniel sat at the same table as before, but today he wore an expensive suit that made him look important. 3 lawyers flanked him like bodyguards. Rebecca had only Penny, but the determined set of her lawyer's shoulders gave her courage. Judge Wilson called the court to order. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that this is a family matter involving minors. I expect complete professionalism. Daniel's lead attorney stood first. He was tall with silver hair and a voice that filled the room without effort. Your Honor, my client has suffered a grave injustice. 10 years ago, he and Ms. Mason underwent fertility treatments together. Embryos were created and stored. After their relationship ended, Ms. Mason used these embryos without Mr. Cooper's knowledge or consent to create the children now living in her home. Rebecca gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. The lies were so outrageous she could barely breathe. "We have documents," the lawyer continued, passing folders to the judge's clerk, showing that genetic material was stored at Westside Fertility Clinic, where Ms. Mason later received treatment. The papers looked official with fancy letterheads and signatures. Rebecca stared at Penny in panic. When Daniel's lawyer finished, Penny stood. Her voice wasn't as loud, but it was clear and steady. "Your Honor, we have one response to these allegations. They are complete fiction. The children in Ms. Mason's care were all adopted through the state foster system after being removed from harmful situations. We have their complete files, including birth records, showing that Ms. Mason has no biological connection to them, and neither does Mr. Cooper." She placed 4 thick folders on the judge's desk. "Furthermore, Ms. Mason has never been a patient at Westside Fertility Clinic. The documents presented by Mr. Cooper's team are forgeries, and we filed a formal complaint with the State Medical Board." The judge flipped through the adoption papers, her expression giving nothing away. "Mr. Cooper," she finally said, looking up, "these adoption records appear thorough and legitimate. Do you have any actual evidence that these children are biologically connected to you?" Daniel leaned forward to whisper to his lawyer, who then stood again. "Your Honor, we request DNA testing of all parties. That will settle this matter conclusively." "Ms. Mason," the judge turned to Rebecca, "do you object to DNA testing?" "No, Your Honor," Rebecca replied. "I welcome it." Judge Wilson nodded. "Very well. I'm ordering DNA tests for Mr. Cooper, Ms. Mason, and all 4 children. Results to be delivered to the court within 10 days. She paused, studying Daniel. "And given the serious nature of potentially falsified medical documents, I'm also ordering a psychological evaluation for Mr. Cooper before our next hearing." Daniel's face darkened. He started to stand, but his lawyer pulled him back down. "Your Honor," Daniel's lawyer protested, "my client's mental health is not at issue here." "I disagree," the judge replied firmly. "When someone makes claims this extraordinary about children who, according to state records, have no connection to him, I need to understand his state of mind." She banged her gavel. "Court is adjourned until test results are available." In the hallway afterward, Rebecca felt lightheaded with relief. Penny squeezed her arm supportively. "That went as well as it could have. The DNA tests will prove he's lying, and the psychological evaluation might reveal what's really going on." As they walked toward the exit, Daniel suddenly appeared in their path. His lawyers weren't with him. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "we need to talk." Penny stepped between them. "My client has nothing to say to you. The restraining order is still in effect." 5 minutes, Daniel insisted. "That's all I'm asking." Something in his voice, a hint of the man she once knew, made Rebecca hesitate. 5 minutes, she agreed, ignoring Penny's warning look. In the conference room, with Penny present. The small room had a table and 4 chairs. Daniel sat across from Rebecca, his hands clasped tightly together. "The children look happy," he began awkwardly. "I saw pictures of them in the court files." "They were happy," Rebecca corrected, "until you showed up claiming to be their father." Daniel looked down. "I didn't expect this to get so complicated." "Complicated?" Rebecca's voice rose. "You abandoned me on our wedding day without a word. 10 years later, you reappear with fake documents trying to take my children. What exactly did you expect?" "I was desperate," he admitted. "My father's will." "I know about the will," Rebecca cut in. $68 million if you have children. That's what this is about, isn't it? Not the kids, the money." Daniel's shoulders slumped. "It's not just the money. It's my family legacy. The Cooper name. My father made it clear that without heirs, everything we built would be given away to strangers. So you tried to steal my family instead." Rebecca shook her head in disbelief. "The DNA tests will prove you're lying. This will all be over soon." "Unless," Daniel leaned forward, "unless we could work something out. The children need a father figure. I have resources, connections. I could give them opportunities you never could. Rebecca stood so quickly her chair fell backward. Are you seriously trying to buy my children? I'm offering a compromise, Daniel insisted. Joint custody. We could even get married like we planned. The kids would have both of us. Penny, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. This conversation is over. Come on, Rebecca. As they reached the door, Rebecca turned back. You know what's sad, Daniel? If you had stayed 10 years ago, if you had been honest about your fears instead of running away, we might have built a family together. We might have adopted children together. I wasn't ready then, Daniel said softly. And I'm not available now, Rebecca replied. Not to you. Not ever again. Outside the courthouse, Rebecca called Thomas to check on the children. They were at the playground, happy and safe, for now. What do you think Daniel will do when the DNA tests come back negative? She asked Penny as they walked to their cars. Something desperate, Penny answered honestly. Men like him don't give up easily. She paused. Maybe we should think about temporary relocation, just until this is over. Rebecca looked up at the gray sky, thinking about everything her family would have to leave behind, their home, the children's school, their friends. All because a man who once claimed to love her now wanted to use them for his own selfish purposes. No, she said firmly. We're not running. This is our home. Daniel Cooper has already taken enough from me. I won't let him take anything more. But as Rebecca drove home to her children, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. 1 week after the hearing, Rebecca's phone rang at midnight. It was Penny. The DNA results came in early, she said without greeting. Just as we expected, there's no biological connection between Daniel and the children. Rebecca sat up in bed, relief washing over her. So it's over? We won? Not quite. The judge has called for an emergency mediation session tomorrow. Daniel's lawyers are still fighting, claiming the lab made errors. That's ridiculous, Rebecca sighed. What time tomorrow? 9 a.m. And Rebecca? Leave the kids with someone you trust. This might get ugly. Sleep was impossible after that call. Rebecca sat in the living room, flipping through old photo albums. Pictures of the children's first days with her. Halloween costumes and birthday cakes. The family they had built together, piece by piece. She paused at a much older photo she kept tucked in the back. Her and Daniel on a beach trip, years before their wedding. They looked so young, so happy. What had happened to that man? How had he turned into someone who would lie and manipulate to get what he wanted? The mediation room at the courthouse was small, with just one large table. Judge Wilson sat at the head, with Penny and Rebecca on one side, Daniel and his lawyer on the other. A court-appointed mediator took notes. Let me be clear, Judge Wilson began, the DNA results show conclusively that Mr. Cooper has no biological connection to these children. Furthermore, the psychological evaluation of Mr. Cooper raised several concerns that I'd like to address today. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Before we proceed, the judge continued, I'm giving both parties one chance to speak plainly about what's really happening here. Ms. Mason. Rebecca took a deep breath. These children are my legal and emotional responsibility. I adopted them through proper channels after fostering them. They've been through enough trauma in their lives before coming to me. This baseless custody claim is causing them more harm. I just want Mr. Cooper to leave us alone. The judge nodded. Mr. Cooper. Daniel looked down at his hands. His expensive lawyer whispered something in his ear, but he shook his head slightly. The DNA tests are accurate, he finally said, his voice barely audible. The children aren't biologically mine. The documents we submitted were created by a firm I hired. A heavy silence filled the room. You falsified evidence in my courtroom. Judge Wilson's voice was dangerously quiet. Yes, Daniel admitted. I was desperate. My father's will. I'm aware of your father's will, Mr. Cooper, the judge cut in. That doesn't justify perjury and fraud. Your Honor, Daniel's lawyer interjected, my client is under extreme duress. The stipulations of his father's will have created an impossible situation. So he decided to steal someone else's children? Penny asked sharply. The mediator raised a hand. Perhaps we should hear Mr. Cooper's full explanation, without interruption. All eyes turned to Daniel. He looked older somehow, the confident businessman facade cracking. 10 years ago, I was supposed to marry Rebecca, he began slowly. We were happy, or at least I thought we were. 2 days before the wedding, we got the results from fertility tests. Rebecca couldn't have biological children. Rebecca flinched at having this private pain exposed so clinically. My father was obsessed with family legacy, Daniel continued. The Cooper name, Cooper blood. When I found out Rebecca couldn't give me biological children, I panicked. I knew my father would cut me off if I married someone who couldn't provide heirs. So you left her at the altar? Without even a conversation? The judge couldn't keep the disapproval from her voice. Daniel nodded, avoiding Rebecca's eyes. I wasn't brave enough to face her. I took a flight to Brazil that morning, started a new life under a different name. And now, the mediator prompted. When my father died 6 months ago, I learned about the condition in his will. No children, no inheritance. Everything our family built for generations would go to charities. I came back to the States to figure out what to do. And you decided to claim Rebecca's adopted children were somehow biologically yours. Judge Wilson's disbelief was palpable. I hired investigators. They found Rebecca had adopted 4 children. It seemed perfect. If I could establish some claim to them, even temporarily, I could satisfy the will's conditions. My lawyers said we just needed to create enough legal confusion to tie things up while we worked on a more permanent solution. A more permanent solution? Rebecca repeated, her voice shaking with anger. What does that mean? Daniel finally looked at her. I was going to offer you money. A lot of money. To go along with the story. You thought I would sell my children's identities, their history. I thought you might want what's best for them. Private schools, college funds, connections. Rebecca cut him off. What's best for them is stability and love, which they have. Not money from a man who abandoned their mother and then tried to steal them through lies. The mediator intervened again. Mr. Cooper, the psychological evaluation mentioned concerns about your decision-making and attachment patterns. Would you like to address that? Daniel's shoulders slumped. After I left Rebecca, I wasn't stable. I had a breakdown in Brazil, spent some time in treatment. The doctors said I had issues with narcissism and obsessive thinking. I got better, or I thought I did. But when my father died and I saw the will, he trailed off. You reverted to old patterns, the mediator finished for him. I guess so, Daniel admitted. The Cooper legacy seemed more important than anything else, more important than honesty, more important than what those kids might need. The room fell silent again. Rebecca studied the man she had once loved enough to marry. She felt something shift inside her, not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of clarity. I have a question, she said suddenly. If you were so concerned about having biological children to please your father, why didn't you just get married to someone else in the last 10 years? Why didn't you have children with someone else? Daniel's face flushed. I tried. 2 relationships. Both ended badly. The doctors in Brazil said I had attachment issues, commitment problems. So you ran from me, then couldn't commit to anyone else, and now you're trying to take my family because you've run out of time to build your own. Rebecca shook her head. That's not just sad, Daniel. It's cruel. Judge Wilson cleared her throat. I've had enough. Given Mr. Cooper's admission of submitting falsified evidence, this custody claim is dismissed. Furthermore, I'm issuing a permanent restraining order prohibiting Mr. Cooper from contacting Ms. Mason or her children. She turned to Daniel with a severe expression. You should be aware that falsifying evidence is a serious offense. I'm referring this matter to the district attorney's office. You may face criminal charges. Daniel's lawyer immediately began arguing about extenuating circumstances, but Rebecca barely heard them. It was over. Her family was safe. As she stood to leave, Daniel called her name softly. Rebecca, I'm sorry. For everything. For leaving you. For this mess. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that. Rebecca looked at him for a long moment. The man who had shattered her heart. The man who had tried to take her children. The man who, in a strange way, had set her on the path to the life she now cherished. I hope you find peace, Daniel, she said finally. Far away from me and my family. She walked out of the courtroom without looking back, already reaching for her phone to call the children. They would make pizza tonight, she decided. Watch a movie together on the couch. Normal family things that suddenly felt like precious gifts. The nightmare was finally over, or so she thought. 2 months passed peacefully. The children settled back into their routines. Tyler made the soccer team. Julie won the school spelling bee. Jack started learning guitar. Little Olivia finally stopped asking if that man was coming back to take them away. Rebecca thought they had put Daniel Cooper firmly behind them until a rainy Tuesday when she found a thick envelope in her mailbox. No return address, just her name written in familiar handwriting. Inside was a letter, along with several legal documents. "Dear Rebecca," it began. "I know you have no reason to read this, but I hope you will." She almost threw it away right then, but something, curiosity, perhaps, or the need for final closure, made her continue. "The court was right to dismiss my case. What I did was inexcusable. I've been seeing a therapist 3 times a week since then, trying to understand why I did what I did. The truth is, I've been running my whole life. Running from my father's expectations, running from commitment, running from the future we almost had together. When I left you on our wedding day, it wasn't just because you couldn't have biological children. It was because I was terrified of disappointing my father. Terrified of building a life that didn't fit his blueprint, and most of all, terrified of not being enough for you. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for another chance. I'm writing to let you know that I've withdrawn my claim to my father's estate. I'm contesting the will on the grounds that its conditions are discriminatory against adoptive families. The money doesn't matter to me anymore. Enclosed, you'll find documents establishing a trust fund for each of your children's education. No strings attached. No expectations. You don't even have to tell them where it came from. It's the least I can do to make amends for the pain I've caused. I'm moving back to Brazil next month. I found purpose there working with a literacy program in underserved communities. It's not the legacy my father wanted for me, but it's one I can be proud of. I truly wish you and your family all the happiness in the world. You deserve it. Daniel. Rebecca set the letter down, surprised to find tears in her eyes. Not tears of pain or anger, but something more complicated. Relief, perhaps, or the final release of a wound that had been slowly healing for years. The legal documents were exactly what Daniel had described: 4 separate trust funds, each containing enough money to send a child to any college they chose. No conditions, no way for him to access the money or use it as leverage. She called Penny immediately. "Are these legitimate?" she asked, after explaining what she received. "They appear to be," Penny confirmed after Rebecca texted her photos of the documents, "and generous, but you don't have to accept them." "I know," Rebecca said. "I need to think about it." That night, after the children were asleep, Rebecca sat on her porch swing, weighing the decision. The money would give her children opportunities she could never provide on a teacher's salary, but it came from the man who had hurt them all so deeply. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "It's Daniel. This is my new number. I understand if you trash the documents. Just wanted you to know there really are no strings attached. I'm trying to do one right thing after so many wrong ones." Rebecca hesitated, then replied, "How do I know you won't use this to try to have a relationship with the kids later?" His response came quickly. "I'll sign any legal document you want promising no contact. This isn't about me, it's about them." A week later, they met at Penny's office. Daniel looked different, healthier, calmer. He signed papers legally renouncing any future claim to the children and promising no contact unless specifically invited by Rebecca. "Thank you for seeing me," he said as they finished the paperwork. "I know it couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," Rebecca admitted, "but I decided that holding on to anger wasn't helping anyone, especially not the kids." "How are they?" Daniel asked cautiously. Rebecca considered the question. "They're amazing. Resilient, kind, smarter than I was at their age." A small smile touched Daniel's face. "They sound a lot like you." "I thought about not telling them where the money came from," Rebecca said after a moment. "But I don't want to build our relationship on lies. When they're older, they'll know." Daniel nodded. "That's fair." As they walked out of the office, an awkward silence fell between them. "When do you leave for Brazil?" Rebecca finally asked. "Next week. The program I'm working with is expanding to new communities. They need people who speak both English and Portuguese. That sounds meaningful. It is, Daniel agreed. For the first time in my life, I'm doing something because I want to, not because my father would approve. They reached the parking lot. Rain fell softly around them. I have one question, Rebecca said, turning to face him. If you could go back to our wedding day, would you still leave? Daniel considered this seriously. I'd like to say no, that I'd be brave enough to stay. But honestly, I wasn't ready then. I wasn't the man you deserved. And now I know what I lost, he said simply, and I'm trying to become someone better, even if it's too late for us. Rebecca nodded. Goodbye, Daniel. I hope you find what you're looking for in Brazil. Goodbye, Rebecca. Thank you for hearing me out. They didn't hug or shake hands. There was too much history between them for casual contact. But as Rebecca watched him walk away, she felt the last piece of an old puzzle finally fall into place. 1 year later, Rebecca received a package from Brazil. Inside was a children's book, written in Portuguese and English, about a teacher who builds a family through love rather than blood. The author was Daniel Cooper. A note was tucked inside. I hope it's okay to send this. The kids in my program asked me to write a story. Your family was my inspiration. Thank you for showing me what real family means. Rebecca read the book to her children that night. When she finished, Jack asked, Is that about us, Mom? Sort of, she answered honestly. It was written by someone who learned an important lesson about what makes a real family. And what's that? Olivia wanted to know. Rebecca looked at the 4 faces around her, different in appearance, alike in the love they shared. That family isn't about who gave birth to you or whose blood you share. It's about who stays, who chooses you every day, who builds a life with you, through all the hard parts and all the happy ones. Like you chose us, Tyler said. And we chose you, Julie added. Rebecca pulled them close. Exactly like that. Later, after the children were asleep, Rebecca wrote a brief email. The book is beautiful. Thank you for understanding what really matters. The children loved it. The reply came the next morning. I'm glad. That means everything. 2 strangers who had once planned to spend their lives together. 2 separate paths that had briefly, painfully collided. And now finally, 2 people who had found their own versions of peace. Rebecca closed her laptop and went to wake her children for school. Her real, chosen, perfect family. The love that had grown from heartbreak. The home she had built from ruins. Some might call it an unexpected ending. But Rebecca knew better. It wasn't an ending at all. It was exactly the life she was meant to live.